yeah, thank you all for joining this OTTERS workshop on legal issues around citizen science projects in water. I'm Joe from EXA, the European Citizen Science Organisation, one of the partners of the consortium. So I'll just share some quick housekeeping and we can get started. Okay, there you are. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
So yeah, just to let you know, yeah, while the speakers are presenting, please please stay muted. We will have a panel discussion afterwards. I'll go through the agenda in a minute. So feel free to enter some questions in the chat during that, and we can try and get to them. We're also going to have this co-creation workshop at the end of the session. So we're going to split into some breakout groups on some different themes. When the breakout groups are active, I'll let you know, and it'll come up in the bottom of the screen in the bar. It says breakout groups, and you can click on it and choose which one you'd like to join. And there will be kind of an interactive board where you can enter comments and all that sort of thing. And also just to let you know that this is being recorded, and we will also share slides from speakers afterwards. Here is the list of panelists and moderators and organisers. So we have Professor Georgios Sylaios from Democritus University of Thrace in Greece. We have Zoe Constantinou from DG Mare, European Commission. We have Ezgi Erkan, attorney at law from Timelex. And we have Meni Broyd, lawyer and partner at Pearl Cohen firm. And then from OTTERS, we have Garabet from American University, Armenia, Menelaus from Agora, Francisco Stressman from EXA, and myself also. So this is the agenda today, a quick update from myself, and then we'll have Georgios presenting on legal considerations and legal frameworks in citizen science, particularly looking at Water Framework Directive and Marine Strategy Framework Directive. We'll have a presentation on data collection and citizen science and practical legal concerns from Zoe, and then we'll have a presentation on data protection and management and ethics from Ezgi. We'll then have a panel discussion with some questions for the speakers, and then we'll progress to the co-creation workshop that I just mentioned, and then we'll have some kind of final feedback and wrap up. So quite a lot to cover, but hopefully we can get it all done in time. Very quick overview of OTTERS. For those who don't know, it stands for Social Transformation for Water Stewardship through Scaling Up Citizen Science. It's a Horizon Europe project and also part of Mission Ocean. June 2025, we have a €1 billion budget, and this is some of the key aims that we're looking to cover through citizen science projects in marine and freshwater, standardizing different citizen science approaches, evaluating the effectiveness of citizen science, coming up with some best practices, as well as gathering and clustering ongoing initiatives in this area. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and I'll hand over to Georgios if he's here. Georgios, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, hi. Hi all. I don't know what you have done. You hacked my computer. It says,
yeah, sorry. I think it was the link I sent. Feel free to click the 3 buttons and read them yourself. But okay. Yes, apologies. I'll also put this in the chat for anyone else. But yeah, please do go ahead.
Let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. Yes?
Yeah, we can see it.
Can you hear me well?
Perfect.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Georgios Sylaios. I'm a professor in Democritus University of Thrace in northern Greece. I'm a partner at Democritus University of Thrace. Is a partner in OTTERS project, which is funded by Horizon Europe. And today I will present to you the key legal considerations in marine and freshwater in relation to the European policy framework, which is the WFD and the MSFD. I have to warn you, I'm not an expert on citizen science. I'm learning, so I am very new to the field, so I have to say that it seems to me a very exciting field for an oceanographer like myself. Let me start with Water Framework Directive. Water Framework Directive is, or else WFD, is the main EU legislation document which really governs the water resources management over all EU member states, and is the document which sets the standards for high water quality and the best possible water resources management over the European Union. So the main goal of WFD is to achieve over the years of its implementation the good ecological and chemical status of all water bodies. And when we speak about water bodies, we mean fresh water, firstly, rivers, lakes, or brackish water at the buffer zone between the watersheds and the marine environment. So we speak about transitional waters like lagoons. And then we have groundwater and the marine water bodies, which are in WFD marine areas, are focusing only on the first 1 kilometer from the coastline. So this is the area of intervention of an application of WFD. So each member state is obliged really to follow certain rules which are common for all member states, and has to divide its country into water districts. These water districts do not necessarily coincide with the administrative bodies, the administrative borders, and each water district then is divided into river basins, and each river basin is then again divided into water bodies. And for example, let me give you an example. Here, this is Greece, and as you can see, it's divided in 14 water districts. So there are quite large areas, although Greece has 13 regional administrative areas. This is the water body 11, the water district 11, which is comprised of two main river basins. One is Struma River over here, Strimon River, and the other is Agitis. So, and then in order to define the water bodies, we need really to follow certain rules. For example, here we have a lake in the middle, which is, or a reservoir, which is a unique water body, and then we have upstream river system and downstream another one. So you have three different water bodies, or here the reservoir or the lake is divided in, again, the shallow part and the deeper part. So there are certain rules and standards in order to follow to divide each water body in a water district. And then the assessment has to follow certain rules. So each member state is obliged again to monitor a series of parameters which fall into these four different classes. Biological data, biological parameters means that each member state has to monitor phytoplankton, zooplankton for each water body, and also the benthic flora and fauna and the fish. Then physicochemical parameters like temperature, conductivity, dissolved oxygen or pH, and then nutrients as well. And then we have the chemical parameters, which are mostly trace metals. Hydromorphology, hydromorphological parameters explain whether the water body is continuous or there are any human interventions that change its character. And then we have the priority substances, which are the humanly developed substances like organic substances, hydrocarbons, any pesticides, herbicides, anything which is really toxic, even in very low concentrations. Parameters A, B, C, and D are grouped to define the ecological status of each water body. And this is the classification scheme we use in WFD. So for the ecological status, we combine all these ABCD parameters, and at the end of the day, we reach a 5-class classification scheme from high to bad. For the chemical status, we mostly focus on the priority substances, and then we have only 2 categories, the good and the failing to achieve the good status. And this is for the surface waters. For the groundwater, we have poor or bad for the ecological status, and for the chemical, again, good and poor. So this is the condition. This is how we classify. So whenever we have a measurement on each of the parameters, on each of these 4 classes, then we compare this value to the reference value. This is called a reference condition value. So at the end of the day, we get an ecological quality ratio, EQR, based on which we are able really to classify each water body according to these parameters. So if this EQR falls within the high or the good class, then we say that this is acceptable and it meets the criteria and the goals of WFD, while if we are really moderate, bad, and poor, then we consider this as unacceptable. And of course, when we have a water body which falls in the low ecological or chemical status, then we have to take certain measures in order to upgrade the condition, the status of this water body. And these certain measures, of course, are related to the socioeconomic. So we need to go to which is the specific parameter which really fails to meet the criteria, who is responsible for this failure, which group of stakeholders, and then socioeconomical implications arise. So this is the final classification scheme for each water body. As you can see from the right to the left, you see that we have a 5-level scale. And then we move to the left, and you see that for the ecological status, we go to the lowest classed element for each. This is the one out, all out principle of the WFD, meaning that for each group of parameters, we go to the lowest classed element. So for each parameter that we are monitoring, according to the EQR, we are considering only the lowest class, and this lowest class is at the end of the day reaching the final, and it determines the final classification of each surface or groundwater bodies. So this is the scheme that we follow in WFD. It's quite complicated. A lot of teams have to collaborate together. And the question is whether citizen science can really help to implement the WFD requirements in terms of water quality monitoring over the EU. And this gives us an understanding of what WFD means. As you can see, from one hand, we have to consider the river basin management to divide the different water districts, river basins, and water bodies, then to monitor the ecological or the chemical status, then to have an integrated approach to study the economical and socioeconomical implications of the measures, overall to have an interdisciplinary and holistic understanding of the complexity of the system. But the most important is the last circle over there, which explains that we need to promote the decentralized policy making by allowing and promoting public participation. So this is where citizen science becomes important, because citizen science is the process in which there is a close collaboration between scientists and the public, so in order to measure the environment at a certain topic. So I will say that citizen science, based on my review in the literature, follows a quite different monitoring methodology. In science, we are interested on a specific value for each specific parameter that we monitor. In citizen science, because we are using easy to use instruments, or rather low-cost instruments, we are producing values which fit within a range of target values. So we are not really getting the exact value for each parameter. And this, however, this gives us an opportunity really to integrate the data of citizen science with that of professional scientists. And here you can see a good example where we have Freshwater Watch, which is a global project, a global citizen science project, which monitors the freshwater resources. And you see here the monitoring of nitrate, which is a very important parameter for the freshwater systems. And at the end of the day, based on this kit, which is developed, we are not reaching an exact value of nitrate concentration, but a range of nitrate concentrations. So there is a very good publication which was published recently on explaining how we can apply citizen science in the case of the UK. Here we see the Thames catchment, the river basin, and you see this hexagonal grid they use for the environmental agencies and for the citizen science. And you see that there is a partial overlap with this yellow. In this yellow, we have the partial overlap between the data that are collected from environmental agencies and the citizen scientists, while we have a complete overlap over here with the red, in the red hexagons. And this gives us, based on this, we can say that there are different habits in sampling. There are gaps in the environmental agencies which are filled by the Freshwater Watch. There is limited overlap. Overall, we can say again that citizen science focus mostly in sampling during the summer and spring, which provides some kind of, leads to some kind of skewing in the water quality assessment. We have very limited data during the winter or especially harsh weather conditions. But, and also there is higher temporal coverage from the environmental agencies. The quality control, however, gave us an understanding that the data which are monitored by environmental agencies and the citizen scientists show similar trends and distributions in terms of nitrate concentrations. Here you see some examples of people collecting data. And another interesting finding is the fact that citizen science mostly focuses in small water bodies, in small streams, very close to its community. So they provide essential information on the status of these small streams, where environmental agencies it's very difficult for professional scientists really to cover all these different small water bodies, especially in fresh water. And I would say that this is an extremely important finding because it gives us an understanding what sort of gaps citizen science can cover in terms of the WFT implementation. So citizen science could serve as an early warning system, providing an initial monitoring of these small water bodies. And then, of course, in case that there are some problems in the assessment of these of certain parameters, then professional monitoring can come later on. I would say, based on this, on the literature review that I have made, that citizen science can support really the polycentric water governance, enhancing the environmental agency monitoring through gap filling, especially in space and also in terms of ecological parameters. Another example is this publication where people are collecting data from agricultural streams, and they assess the impact of pesticides, which of course falls, as I explained, in the chemical monitoring, and this gives us in the priority substances. So this is FLOW project, which is developed a citizen science stream monitoring program for small streams. And here we have monitoring of microinvertebrate communities and hydromorphological data. I explained that these are, again, extremely important for the biological and for the hydromorphological parameters of WFT, and it gives us an understanding on the pressure which is exerted on each stream and the degradation. And here you see there is a very nice correlation between the data that are collected, the results that are reached by professionals, and the results that are reached by citizen scientists. And as you can see, the correlation coefficient is 0.71, especially when we are speaking about microinvertebrate abundance in terms of family level. This Pearson correlation is a bit lower when we are speaking about taxa level. So this is because, of course, the audience, the big broad audience or the citizens are not well trained to identify the organisms at species level. Overall, we can say that citizen science are suitable to assess the stream health and ecological status according to the requirements of the Water Framework Directive, and this is a nice diagram which gives us the bias between the citizen science and the professional, the correlation in terms of a certain indicator which is called SPARE indicator and measures the toxicity of pesticides in small streams. This gives us really the insight to move forward and to see the Marine Strategy Framework, which follows more or less a similar approach. But here we have 11 descriptors. So we have, as you can see, biodiversity descriptors, alien species, invasive species, the commercial fisheries, food webs, eutrophication, seafloor integrity, hydrographic conditions, the environmental pollution, the seafood pollution, and marine litter and underwater noise. These are the 11 descriptors and the sub-descriptors, the criteria that MSFD is focusing on. And this is the classification scheme that MSFD follows. So as you can see, it's completely different than the one from WFT. Either a water body, a marine water body, a marine water area falls within the good or the not good ecological status or good environmental status. So the question again is whether citizen science can support the implementation of MSFD. And let's see that here we have very limited literature. The marine domain has lagged behind the terrestrial counterpart, and this is of course as a result of the fact that citizens have limited access to the open ocean and to the open marine areas for sampling. A good example is Plankton Planet, which is a project for collecting data in accordance to descriptor 5. As you can see, descriptor 5 is on eutrophication, so you see laser sailing boats and a specially designed sampling net for the collection of phytoplankton. And then there is a kit for the DNA and RNA analysis, again in relation to descriptor 5. Also, there is another project in UK and in Ireland for monitoring the coastal flora and fauna in relation to descriptors 1 and 2. One is on biodiversity, descriptor 2 is on alien species. So again, there are some actions, citizen science actions that are directed towards MSFD implementation. And another one in Spain, where we have the monitoring of Posidonia oceanica meadows. This falls in the criteria of descriptor 6, which is related to seabed integrity. And one of the key aspects of citizen science, of course, is training. We need to train people. We need to train the public on how to do these measurements. As you can see here, they organize a webinar, a training session for the people that would like really to provide the data. Another example in relation to descriptor 10, marine litter, we have here with, again, a sailing boat collecting data of using a manda troll net, specially designed net for the collection of floating particles, of floating debris and marine litter in relation to descriptor 10. And another example is here you see project VC, which collects data on pH. pH is an extremely important parameter according also to the United Nations SDGs. And because the sea and the ocean is acidifying, so this is related to descriptor 5 on eutrophication and descriptor 7 on hydrographic conditions. As a conclusion, I would say that the collaboration between marine science communities and marine policymakers is needed to develop a better understanding on how citizen science can contribute to support the implementation of EU legislation, especially, as I explained, WFD and MSFD. There is plenty of room to do that. We have to organize targeted citizen science projects. Also, the integration of the public in fresh and marine water quality monitoring appears in accordance to the Aarhus Convention, establishing the right of the public to engage in environmental decision-making and environmental monitoring, of course. And I would say that OTTERS is a project to foster the compliance of citizen science data with international data and metadata standards to achieve consistency in data description, data quality, intercomparability, interoperability with other data sets. So, thank you very much. I hope I was on time.
Thank you, Georgios. Yeah, very these are important frameworks and some really good connections with how to actually implement these in relation to the framework. So thank you. I'll keep us moving, and I'd like to introduce Zoe Mare. So would you like to go ahead and
yes,
and present on data
sharing
management
now my
and
screen.
monitoring?
Can you see my screen, Joe?
Yes, yes.
Great, excellent. So let me start by saying that this is a presentation on citizen science and ocean data collection that is prepared by EMOTNET, the European Marine Observation and Data Network, particularly physics, that they're working very much on citizen science and the relative considerations, but by my colleagues Antonio Novellino and Patrick Courage. They couldn't be here today, and this is why it is delivered by me, that I am Zoe Costandino, a policy officer responsible for the European Marine Observation and Data Network in DG Mare, and I work in issues of marine knowledge in general. So to start, my colleagues start with the very basics of citizen science as participatory science, thus scientific work, for example, that is collecting information with the use from people that don't have specific qualifications to deal with this information. But during the last years, it has emerged as a powerful tool and as an engaging activity to bring citizens closer to the environment, to use them in monitoring, and to motivate them also to work on restoration and scientific research. Apparently, here in the European Commission, we have asked that 20% of marine data should come from citizen science by 2025, taking into consideration that we expect that in general, the provision of marine data will increase in the following years. So when we speak about citizens' science data collection, we speak about data that are collected while citizens are doing other activities mostly. So they can be fishing, they can be sailing, they can be, sometimes these are hobby activities, leisure activities in free time, sometimes are activities of professional nature. And the idea is that the projects are built in a way that specific communities are involved in collecting data. In some cases, especially for the projects that are related to internet physics, this includes sensors that are cheap, but they may need validation by a scientific team, a scientific source. And there are different workflows and resolutions, different kind of data that can be collected, like data from chip sensors, annotations or pictures or more. There are multiple legal concerns related to this data, and these have to do with the privacy, the quality, the security, the ethics of collections, how we use this data, and more. The ethics around research are based in clear understanding that there is distinction between a researcher and a participant in a research projects. And the idea is to focus on the protection of the citizen scientists, of the participants from harm and from any kind of liability, if you want. Citizen science research can take a number of forms, starting from completely centralized to completely decentralized, and to have an intermediate form as well. So the European Citizen Science Association has developed a number of principles for citizen science, 10 of them that are presented in this slide. So the first one is that citizen science projects actively involve citizens in endeavors of scientific nature that generate new knowledge, data, or understanding. These kind of projects have a genuine and legitimate science outcome. The benefits from these scientific projects are both ways for the scientists and for the participants of the citizen science. And the citizens can participate in different and multiple stages of this scientific process to gain ownership also to the process. And the idea is also that they receive feedback from the project, and it's a scientific report like any others with its limitations and biases that in the amount possible should be considered and controlled. The data and the metadata that are coming out of citizen science projects are made publicly available, and when it is possible, these results are published in an open access format, so everybody can have access to it. The citizen science should be acknowledged in the results and publications of this work. And these programs are evaluated both for the scientific output, data quality, the experience of the participants, and the wider impact that they have in society or policy. Finally, the leaders of citizen science projects need to take into consideration legal and ethical issues surrounding copyright, intellectual property rights, data sharing agreement, confidentiality of the data of the participants, and more, attribution, and of course, the environmental impact of any activity. And here you can see different examples of citizen science projects, especially like the ones that internet physics are involved to. So here there are projects that are related to subsurface data, fishing activity, sailing activity, and different kind of opportunity, ships that collect different kind of information, smart sensors, open CTD that collects conductivity, temperature, and density data, different educational projects that include students, and more. Now, we talked before about the different structure of citizen science project. The first one is absolute centralization. And this is where the actual scientists, the professional scientists, lead completely the process, and citizen scientists follow their specific instructions, and they have, as citizens, no influence on the course of a study. Including the purposes and means of personal and other data processing. This is the case of a number of citizen science projects as the Fishing Observatory Voluntary Network, Sailing for Science, Students Drifter, and the Ocean Race. And some of the considerations there is that the professional researchers in these cases can be subject to obligations that are not applicable to the citizen scientists themselves. Such, for instance, archiving raw research data to enable the verification of study results and to ensure scientific integrity. And for these purposes, they should sometimes process personal data. And the citizen science have no say, let's say, in this processing, regardless of their wishes. So they are not considered in control of this process. In these projects, training occurs, especially in the cases where there is involvement of specific methodological techniques and protocols. There are different kinds of projects where there is absolute decentralization of the citizen science and the collection of data. And in these cases, the citizens are the drivers of the research, and they can determine the purposes and the means of the data processing. And the professional scientists are not directly involved in the collection process. The citizens are the controllers and the processors of what is collected and shared. These kind of projects have usually a different aim, and they are used mainly to promote environmental awareness and literacy, and to engage citizens, communities, students, specific groups to come closer to the environment. And to develop bigger connection and understanding of the aims and purposes of marine research also. So some kind of examples are the marine pollution monitoring and restoration actions. Here my colleagues have put a link of this project that has collected more than 10,000 plastic bottles and traced this data to OSPAR and the evidence. And of course, here we have different kind of concern. One of the concerns referred to the accountability of the citizen scientists and the trust that somebody can have to the data. And of course, this becomes a little bit more crucial when the citizen science activity deals with considerations that may have implications to health. Finally, and probably the most used case for projects for the collection of data through citizen science is the mixed case. In these cases, there is a project and the participants, they have to be informed about the purposes of the project, and they have to agree with the data processing, similar to giving an agreement to a Facebook page or another page administrator in the conditions of use. There are also considerations here. So for instance, in some cases, the data policy may include the disclosure of some personal information, who collected, when they collected. And if the participant has not actually agreed with that policy, the project has to find alternative ways to deal with the data by anonymizing them, by blurring positions, sometimes in worst case scenario by excluding the subset that doesn't have this this agreement of use. Some examples of this work include, for instance, the temperature of the water column from scuba diving computers, where there is need of anonymization of the IP of the computer, and there is need for spatial grading also to blur positions. And of course, in another matter that is quite controversial, the one way or the other, the collection of the use of fishing vessels in order to collect alternative information as physics information. Many times there is need to hide the real position of the vessel, or to make it, for instance, not accurate in order to cover the requirements of the citizen science participants, that they wouldn't like to reveal their position for competition reasons. Now, there is international law on oceanographic data, and there are some legal considerations coming from there. Unlike meteorological data that is considered common good, ocean data is in territorial waters is the property of the neighboring states. So if you carry oceanographic campaign off the coast of a foreign country, you must request official authorization from the country concerned, which may take considerable amount of time. So this is a consideration for citizen science projects. There is some effort to change this international legal framework to make it easier, but there are still barriers that are related with security, and it's still quite difficult to facilitate structure initiatives, for instance, related to sailing, to have an actual stronger impact. So when non-national waters are targeted, it is probably preferable to follow established pathways and workflows in order to be able to have also an easier rollout of the project. So for instance, if you want to deploy small boats or drifters, it's good to get a specified code from the World Meteorological Organization or another organization similar to that. Now, other data concerns related to citizen science data is the perception regarding the data quality. Despite the several studies that are demonstrating that, as Georgios said as well, that the data meet acceptable quality standards. These concerns relate sometimes, but are not limited to, the lack of attention to project design and standardized data verification methods that have limited also participant training and sampling biases. But as my colleagues say, the aim is not necessarily to reach the highest precision level with citizen science data, but to provide a consistent data quality and description of limitations that actually define the boundaries of the use of these applications. And also, I would add that another aim is to establish data flows that are consistent and that can be considered stable for use in multiple different areas. So regarding the European Marine Observation and Data Network, and specifically physics, we are focusing on cases that there is either a centralized or semi-centralized approach to citizen science data collection. In these cases, there is either a researcher or an institute which is mainly accountable for the data management responsibility, and who has the main responsibility for consensus, for privacy, for GDPR, for scopes of all the action and of the quality and trustiness of the collected data. This entity is also in charge for data storage and for data formatting. So, for instance, physics is putting specific effort in guiding in adoption of standards, tools to implement findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable data, and more. When we talk about personal data, so data that are coming from that is coming from the citizens, this data is usually disassociated from the parameters. So an idea is not to award to the initiative, to the project, and not to the single citizen that collected the data. Applies blurring and grading where it's when it's possible, but when it's not applied. And here my colleagues have put two examples. For the time being, we have a project that is in the US collecting temperature from mini logs on lobster cases, where there is delivery of gridded raw data. And there's the example of some fishermen that asked to hide or blur their position in order to not have competition. So for the moment, we haven't resolved this kind of issues. It's quite difficult. It's probably more possible to disassociate the actual source of the data than hide the actual source of the data than actually hide the specific position, especially when we are talking about physical parameters. But it is certain that there is a relevant need for intermediate aggregating layers to help streamlining this data and to overcome this kind of problems. And in the final slides, you can find a number of publications from EMOTNet Physics related to citizen science that can be made available for you to read further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Yes, it's really a good overview and some very good specific examples as well of how we can integrate some of these things. Thank you very much. Ezgi, are you okay to start? I'll hand over to you.
Yes, sure. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, that's showing it.
Excellent. This presentation is going to be about data protection and management in water-based citizen science. And I believe it will actually complement Zoe's presentation. I'll briefly go through ethical rules and data protection rules concerning water-based citizen science. And a very brief practical module will be there in case we have the time, maybe also for discussion. I come from Timelex. It's a Brussels-based law firm. We are on top of client work, also involved in 30+ ongoing Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe projects. And one of these is actually Regace. If you're curious about this project about agrivoltaics, feel free to check it out. So the introduction and objective, the objective of this meeting is covering the most relevant principles of data protection and management in water-based citizen science with examples. We'll try to be brief as we have only 15 minutes. Activities that may raise data protection and management issues in water-based citizen science might relate to collection and retention of personal data, as Zoe also mentioned, or data sharing, and even how this data is anonymized and pseudonymized. As regards collection and retention, some of the issues might relate to using IoT devices, smartphones, and also transparency of communication with participants. It's incredibly relevant. And as regards data sharing, sharing data with third parties, it is usually a topic that needs careful consideration under the GDPR, especially if it concerns location, health, water usage habits, and data sharing agreements and transparency is of utmost importance here. And also transfers to third countries. It's also very, very relevant under the GDPR, but I'll come back to that later. So let's begin with the ethical part. So in EU-funded research, this is incredibly relevant. All researchers have an ethical obligation to protect the participants' dignity, autonomy, privacy, welfare, and safety, and also to ensure that they are treated fairly and with respect. And these principles are anchored in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, the European Convention on Human Rights, and in various ethics codes, such as the Nuremberg Code, the Helsinki Declaration, and the Belmont Report. We don't have time to go very deep into these, but the overarching ethical principles in EU-funded research are also around these legal documents, and some that are incredibly relevant to water-based citizen science is ensuring transparency, respecting autonomy, protecting vulnerable individuals, ensuring privacy and confidentiality, and sharing benefits with disadvantaged populations, especially if the research is being carried out in developing countries. Of course, respecting and protecting the environment and future generations. This is part of the reason why citizen science is so important for the society. And it, we can say, inherently aims to promote justice and inclusiveness. Personal data, we can take this both from an ethical and legal perspective, because data protection is it's both an integral issue for research ethics, and it is a fundamental human right. It is a concept that's closely linked to human dignity, autonomy, and privacy of the participants. And in citizen science, actually, we see that it's not only the participants, but also the households or people living in these locations that might also be impacted by the results. So we can say, especially in citizen science, this concerns both the participants and the society as a whole. And specifically, the right to data protection is guaranteed by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Of course, there is the GDPR, this very influential piece of legislation that's applicable throughout the European Union. And the right to data protection gives effect to the right to privacy by providing individuals with the autonomy and control over the way information about them is collected and used. So speaking about data protection is actually not that easy in 10 or 15 minutes. However, the points of attention in the context of water-based citizen science is, for instance, the concept of personal data, knowing what constitutes personal data and what does not constitute personal data. Knowing a bit more about anonymization and its difference with pseudonymization. This is also relevant, and these are what I will cover in the next 5 minutes. Transparency as well, the lawfulness of processing, and whether it is the best idea to rely on consent or another lawful ground provided under the GDPR. And if we rely on consent, whether it is free and informed. And in cases where different parties, for instance, different consortium members share data, whether there are data sharing agreements in place. And in cases where there are third country data transfers, for instance, between an EU country and a non-EU country, whether these data transfers comply with the GDPR. And next to data protection, EU-funded research also has legal requirements that are relevant to how to conduct the research in general. So we have some requirements for open access and data management. There's also the obligation to comply with ethical and research integrity principles and to avoid abuse and misuse of research results. So these are the most relevant points, and I will be covering them one by one to the extent that the time allows us. So what is personal data? This is a concept that is very integral because when there is personal data, the GDPR applies. Personal data is actually any information that relates to a natural person, so not an organization or a company, that is identified or identifiable. Here, identifiable is actually a key term because sometimes we receive the question whether a data that can be identifiable somewhere in the near future can also be considered as personal data. And well, it is not really possible to be future-proof in today's age. So a data that's identifiable per se is personal data, and it is better to treat this data as personal data instead of not treating it as personal data, because this way the assessment is there, it has been completed, and this reduces legal and financial risk. An example can be an IP address. Sometimes we get the question whether, okay, I'm conducting an anonymous survey, but I am registering the IP addresses of the users. Am I processing personal data? The answer is, well, yes. There's actually some EU court jurisdiction that ruled that IP address can be personal data if it can identify a natural person. So it is usually the better approach to consider data as personal data if it can identify a natural person. But when we say it is personal data and the GDPR applies, it does not mean that processing is forbidden or restricted. It only means that some topics need to be covered and the implications need to be assessed. For instance, pseudonymization, where direct identifiers like name, address, etc., have been removed, it's actually still identifiable data. And here, the key is transparency, because when you're transparent with the data subjects, so the people that have this data that can identify themselves, you just need to be transparent with them and make sure that the key concepts, the key principles of the GDPR are respected. So a term here is anonymization. It's very important to cover this concept mainly because usually the terms anonymization and pseudonymization are confused. So anonymization, it actually means that the information no longer relates to an identified or an identifiable person. And if the data is truly anonymized, then GDPR will no longer apply to this data anymore. Of course, there are different methods. There's K anonymity, T closeness, L diversity. Of course, this will depend on the case, but there are some different methods, and there's some research about which method can be suitable to which case. All in all, there are the principles that need to be respected in all cases, because, for instance, even if you are the party anonymizing the data, you're still collecting it, like there needs to be a purpose limitation. It needs to be limited to the purpose that you are collecting it for, like minimizing the data. for water-based citizen science, especially, accuracy is important, mainly as if, for instance, this data is being public in one way or another, and this data is not accurate, then it will actually not comply with the principle of accuracy, because data protection, it also means that the data concerning the data subjects need to be as accurate as possible. For instance, if there's a party that is retaining your personal data, however, they, for instance, lose your personal data, then it is also a problem, because the right to data protection, it does not only concern privacy, but it also concerns how your data is retained, and how secure it's being treated. So these are also some points that need consideration. And of course, the lawfulness of personal data processing is one of the key points of the GDPR. Usually, there is a misunderstanding that consent is the overarching and the best lawful ground that one can rely on. Consent, of course, when it's free and informed consent, is a very strong and ethical lawful ground that one can rely on. But one thing that needs to be mentioned here is that when researchers rely on consent, it also means that consent can be taken back. So there are some other lawful grounds that sometimes might be suitable. For instance, legitimate interest. Legitimate interest requires a balancing exercise involving substance, necessity, and proportionality tests. And once the data processing operations pass this three-step test, it means that one can rely on legitimate interest. It means that, well, this is important to me and it doesn't hurt you. And I did the balancing exercise, and I can rely on this. For instance, sometimes there's a legal obligation, and personal data has to be processed, but this is not always the case. And then sometimes there's a contract and data needs to be processed based on this contract. It's very relevant to do this exercise and to know which lawful ground you're relying for when processing personal data. And data reuse is another important aspect in this respect, because one needs to take into account the link between the purposes, the context of gathering the data, the nature of data, and the possible consequences of reusing data, and whether extra safeguards exist, for instance, pseudonymization, because it's the sometimes point of these EU-funded research to make sure that there is free and open access to the research results, but it does not necessarily mean that personal data can be freely shared. It actually never means that. Research, on the other hand, is presumed compatible when it actually qualifies as research, because research per se is not defined by the GDPR. So how like the scope of research is important. The context is very important. And reuse is possible when it's for research purposes, but it's incompatible if, for instance, there's no actual link between the purposes, and it hasn't been communicated to the data subject, or it has been communicated in a completely different way. So it actually requires a case-to-case assessment to know whether data reuse is compatible or not. But for research, it's usually compatible, especially when there are some safeguards such as pseudonymization. I mean, it still requires, of course, a case-based analysis. This is the part that I believe is the most relevant for water-based citizen science, because well, data management and open data, they are they're highly relevant in research. This is not really a GDPR topic, but of course it's related. Data sharing is usually it's always an obligation under the grant agreement. And it's important for the data that relates to publications. It's also relevant to all other research data, subject to specific exceptions to be explained in the data management plan, of course. And that's because of GDPR considerations, intellectual property considerations, security considerations, and confidentiality considerations. This is also why I believe there are some very good synergies between this presentation and the previous presentation, because there you could actually see the list of certain considerations that have been taken into account. This is actually an example that I would like to share with you. I don't believe that the time allows us to actually do this interactively, so I will try to be a bit brief. However, this is a citizen science project that is taking into account some measurements that have been made in the soil. And even though this example looks like it's anonymous, when you actually zoom in the map, you can see on a household level the levels of pollution in soil. For instance, in a case like this, sometimes researchers can think that making this data completely public and available to any interested party can be a great idea. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not, but all I'm saying is sometimes there can be some implications that need to be taken into account before making certain decisions. So, for instance, in a case like this, let's say the researchers that shared this data are living in a very small commune, and let's say the data here shows that the area is highly polluted. Then perhaps there are some there might be some consequences related to making this data available to public in a very open way. For instance, does this platform take any precautions to prevent data miners from scraping this data? Because imagine, for instance, if there's a real estate agency that's constantly scraping this data, would it have any influence in the future for the pricing of the houses? Or imagine an insurance company scraping this data and making some inferences based on the health of the individuals living in certain areas. Will it then mean that after 20 or 30 years, these individuals will need to pay higher insurance premiums? So these are some integral questions that arise when data is being made to public, and data protection remains relevant. Because especially if we want to share data outside what was initially planned, then we actually need to assess whether this is possible. Protecting confidentiality and anonymity is incredibly relevant, and attention must be given to data management in terms of sharing of data and when publishing, there's need to deliver data sets in some form with the publication. And also, we must reflect on security obligations and, of course, to avoid misuse. That's also the point of the previous case, to make sure that misuse is avoided. And let's revisit anonymization, because in this example, we saw that we could actually zoom in to household level. And well, not identified or identifiable, does it really mean that this will be the case for the future? Actually, studies show that with big data, re-identification becomes scarcely easy. There's the famous Netflix example, maybe you have heard of this before, but with 2 movies and with rating and date of rating, the possibility of re-identification is 68%. With 6 or more obscure movies without date of rating, it's 84%. And when you add the date of rating, it's 99%. And these were supposedly be anonymous records. Well, the bar is a bit low for qualifying data as personal data, and recombining and cross-referencing data may lead to identification. So the point here is that the qualification as personal data is not a prohibition, but compliance measures have to be taken. Again, it's usually better to be on the safer side to treat too much as personal data compared to the other way around. And usually there's a project checklist. Projects usually define an ethical mission statement and expected challenges. And then there's usually a data management plan, DMP, for initial mapping of data flows and the parties involved. In certain projects, there can be a DPIA, a data protection impact assessment, and usually the implementation of compliance measures and monitoring compliance is the next step. And once the project terminates, there of course needs to be in place a sustainable strategy to ensure that this ethical mission statement is applied for the results. All in all, to conclude, there are, of course, many legal and ethical aspects in citizen science. And of course, we could talk for hours about it. But of course, none of these points will prevent citizen science projects from being implemented. Saying this, all points, of course, need to be addressed effectively. If you have any questions or comments later, feel free to contact us. I hope I did not go too much over time.
No, all good. Thank you very much, Eski. That was a great presentation covering very important aspects of privacy and data protection, which when it comes to citizen science projects, it kind of can't be overstated really. So thank you to all the speakers. We're running over slightly, but we'll move into a panel discussion for maybe kind of 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, and then we can split into breakout groups. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. But I think I'll kick things off to Many, and just to introduce Many, the partner from Pearl Cohen. So perhaps Many, you could kind of just give a little bit of background to your own work and your kind of experience with law and citizen science, and maybe you could just answer the question of what are some of the main legal documents that are required when you're operating a citizen science platform. It'd be good to hear that.
Okay, many thanks for the introduction. My name is Manny Floyd. I am a partner at a law firm with the name of Pearl Cohen. We are a large law firm based in Israel, and we collaborate a lot with Agora. And with respect to your question, you asked me about, what would be the main legal documents needed to actually operate a citizen science platform. First of all, I would like to mention that At the end of the day, the citizen science is integrated into website platforms in many cases. And if we really want to get some impact out of citizen science, at the end of the day, we need to see it implemented, integrated in a website platform. And in order to do this, you will need to operate a website platform. And specifically with respect to your question, in order to operate a website platform, usually you need at least 2 documents, and in some cases also 3. The main document would be the terms of use. The terms of use from legal perspective constitutes an agreement under which the platform determines the terms and conditions that would apply to the use of the platform. And this usually would be accepted by the contributors and in some cases also by the users. Because in these platforms, in many cases, the citizens contribute science, but other citizens or even the same citizens act as users in the platform and directly benefit from the citizen science. I will just quickly mention some of the bullet points that are addressed in terms of use, which is the main document. Who owns and operates the platform, whether the platform is for profit or it's non-profit. Sometimes you wish to limit access, such as, for example, only to individuals who are at least 13 years old. You condition the access and the use upon acceptance of the terms. You mentioned what would be the responsibility of the contributors who post material to the platform. For example, with respect to ownership, they should make sure that the posted material doesn't infringe rights of others, doesn't continue viruses, is not defamatory. You also need to address the issue of intellectual property rights. Usually it will say that the contributor retains the intellectual property rights to the content he contributed, but agrees to license the content to the platform for its use. And also it would say that the platform outputs are owned by the platform itself, not by the contributor. You need to determine whether contributors will or will not get attributions. The platform would also limit its responsibility towards the users, will retain termination rights, limit its liability, and also should determine what law would apply and what would happen in the event of dispute resolution. So this is the first main document of relevance to when you operate a website platform in the framework of citizen science. A second document, I will not get into detail because ESGI touched upon many of the relevant issues, would be the privacy policy. Only on this, I would say that ESGI put emphasis to GDPR, but if you are running a platform with international activities and the application, you may need to also add specific disclosures for additional countries of relevance. So this is the second document of relevance. And the third one it's not always applicable. These are the community guidelines. In many cases, platforms have community guidelines. It's something it's a document not strictly legal. It's between legal and general guidelines. It contains information as to what is the expected behavior, grounds for suspension or blocking of access, mentions things that are okay, behavior that is acceptable, usually requests to use tone that would be respectful and polite, and to use accessible, understandable language. So these are the three documents. that are of relevance if you wish to bring into life, into actual life, citizen science in a form that will enable contributors to contribute and users to benefit.
Thanks so much, Many. Yeah, this is a really helpful checklist if somebody's establishing a platform or a new project or something. This is really important information. So thank you. Lucrina, I think you have a question. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, actually, I had a question for Ezgi, but now that Manny was speaking, I was also thinking about a question for him. So the first question is for Ezgi. So you talked about anonymization. So we are anonymizing our data when we go to the field and talk to people, to citizen scientists. But then when we turn this data into, let's say, for example, social network analysis, then we anonymize it, and we anonymize it based on the type of stakeholder that we are interviewing. For example, in the area where we have our project, there is only one NGO, environmental NGO. So it is very easy for people to recognize, deduce the name of the NGO because it's the only one in that area. And how are we supposed to protect its anonymity if it's the only one? It's like we are referring to it like the representatives of the environmental NGO, but it's only one, so it is very easily recognizable from the context. What do we do in this specific context?
Thank you for the excellent question. As a matter of fact, this question, I can divide it in two parts. So first part, what is personal data? So personal data is any data that's that identifies or that can identify a natural person. In this case, I see that we're talking about an NGO, which is not necessarily a natural person. However, if this NGO also has just a single person working in this area that can be identified, then we might be talking about personal data. However, in principle, under the GDPR, if it's just the name of the company and it does not identify a natural person, we do not treat it as personal data. However, on the presumption that it actually identifies a person, for instance, if there's only one person in this area and when you anonymize just based on location, it's possible to identify this person, then unfortunately this anonymization method is not going to be an effective one. So in this case, what can be done is to make the grouping a little bit more general. For instance, instead of anonymizing based on let's say city by city, you can try to do it on a country basis or try to aggregate the data. So there are different methods of anonymization that I also shared during the presentation. It might be useful to have a look at these methods and to see if one of those might be a more suitable alternative. But then at the end of the day, if it's not identifying a natural person, then the chances are that it's going to be less problematic.
Yeah, okay. I don't know how we'll do that because it's from our analysis, it points out very clearly that it is the president of that particular NGO and that it is identifiable as a natural person, but we will think about these methods for anonymization. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Maybe I can have a follow-up question on that. Two things. One, Ezgi, you mentioned that informed consent is important, but when this data is shared with third parties and ends up being used for something that was not initially intended, how to deal with that issue. A similar but somewhat different question is, and this is something that also many mentioned, if you have a website platform and the data is scraped off a website platform by a third party altogether, and now with a lot of AI tools, ChatGPT, etc., this could actually be done by not even an individual, but by artificial intelligence. Who's responsible for that? Third, you said the consent could be withdrawn at any time by the individual. But if that data ends up already with a third party or a repository or a data hub, etc., even in an anonymized format, how can you withdraw it afterwards when it's part of, I don't know, terabytes of data and it's already anonymized? Maybe also, Zoe, afterwards, you could also contribute to the commercialization of citizen science data and how it also contributes to this consent being given if the individual is not aware of how the data will eventually be commercialized 3, 4, 5 steps down the line when we're talking about digital twins or data repositories and hubs and such. So I'll start with Ezgi and then we see how the conversation goes.
Okay, so there are 3 questions, and I also haven't forgotten about Luprina's question to many. Maybe then shall I go ahead and respond to the 3 questions concerning free and informed consent, data mining, and what happens when consent is withdrawn?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's begin with free and informed consent. So consent, it's only one of the lawful grounds that one can rely on under the GDPR. So to rely on consent, it has to be free and informed, and this means that, and it also has to be specific to the purpose. So when obtaining consent, it needs to be explained to the data subjects in an intelligible way what is intended, what is going to be done with this data. Data subjects need to understand the possible implications, and this way we can ensure free and informed consent. Also, data subjects must have the option to refuse. So this is the free version. So informed version is to ensure that it's transparent and it's intelligible. And free is that they are not obliged to consent because it's bundled up with another thing that they might need. So these are the main conditions. But of course, this will always require a case-by-case analysis. So this is the general framework. However, consent is only one of the lawful grounds that one can rely on under the GDPR. There can also be, for instance, legal obligation when, for instance, an entity has to process your personal data because there's a legal obligation because the law requires so, but this will not be applicable to your case. For instance, there can be legitimate interest. It basically means that you have done the exercise of balancing whether passing the substance, necessity, and proportionality tests. So substance test meaning that there's nothing that's inherently legal. Necessity test meaning that the processing of personal data is necessary to achieve the intended legitimate purpose. And the balancing test, meaning that whether or not you have taken the precautions to ensure that the fundamental rights of the data subjects have not been jeopardized to in a way that's not proportionate to reach these intended purposes with the data processing. So this is a 3-step test. And I believe in water-based citizen science, for instance, there are different cases. For instance, of course, it would require a case-by-case analysis, but for instance, in the map that I show, that I showed, you could actually see on a household level whether the soil is dirty or not. But then there's also the data of the neighbors that can be deduced, and nobody has ever asked consent from these people. So you cannot even rely on consent for this. And in this case, you will find yourself making the assessment whether or not you can rely on legitimate interest, which will actually also require the third step of the legitimate interest impact assessment, which is proportionality. Which brings me to your next question, whether or not an AI can scrape this data. If you're operating a platform like this, it is actually your responsibility to prevent any scrapers from operating in your system. It is completely, absolutely right that if some operators of AI are scraping this data, and if one of the participants that actually consented this data that can be linked to them would like to withdraw, then maybe as a platform owner, you will want to delete this data, but then you cannot actually even probably find these scrapers that actually took away this information. So this is why there of course needs to be a very, very careful case-based analysis before making the data publicly available. And of course, this doesn't mean that it's impossible not to share this data openly to ensure that this data can be used for further research. This is actually one of the, of course, main purposes of why this research is being done. So the point is, of course, to make sure that data is shared to the extent that is possible, but this has to be done in a fair way as well. So it means that there needs to be an exercise of assessing the legitimacy. And for instance, in this case, one can say, okay, maybe I will try to make this maybe log the access, or to log whenever someone is checking this data, or to authorize users, like to limit access. These are some of the things that just come to my mind at the moment that might also, of course, depend on the case, because I believe in water-based citizen science, it's actually different than the example that I showed you, that I have shown. Mainly as maybe in this case, it will not be possible to deduce this data on a household level. It will really depend on the data that can be linked to certain individuals, and that can identify these individuals. So in a nutshell, just to come back to the three questions. One, informed consent. We covered the essentials of free and informed consent. Two, scrapers, AI, and responsibility. We covered this one. And what happens when consent is withdrawn? I believe we also covered that. And in a nutshell, the principles are here, but the answer will really depend on the use case.
If I may, just a short addition, I think that when we refer to withdrawal or revocation of consent, we need to make a distinction between the information of relevance to this revocation of consent. If the consent is revoked or withdrawn with respect to personal information of individuals, then the contributor of this information would have much greater right to revoke his consent, because all this information is subject to GDPR with all the strict requirements under GDPR. But on the other hand, if we're talking about, let's say, an individual that contributes some information, let's say, about jellyfish to a platform, and he wishes to revoke or withdraw his consent as to the use of the content that he provided us to the jellyfish, then we can limit that, because if he signed the terms of use, and in the terms of use, we can say that if he gives the consent, then we can use it, and we can rely upon this consent, and he can not revoke it. He can, of course, stop contributing additional information, but because this is not this type of contribution, as opposed to individual information or private information as to individuals, this type of information is not protected by GDPR, so it can be governed by the terms of use, and his ability or his right to withdraw its consent from this use can be eliminated.
I completely agree. If it does not identify or can identify a natural person, then it is not personal data.
Very clear.
Agree.
Thank you both.
Robert, would you like to, yes, can you please repeat your question about the commercialization of data?
Yeah, Manny already kind of answered, but I'll give you also the opportunity if you want to expand more on that. My idea was, say a local NGO or a project are collecting data for whatever reason, estimating water quality, etc. And then that data is taken or scaled up all the way to EmoteNet or any other data repository. And then a third party uses that data to commercialize it, similar to the idea that Ezgi brought up by real estate companies or whatever. The original data provider, the citizen, provided it for research purposes or for data quality purposes, but then that data ended up being used for commercial purposes, which was not communicated to that individual. Manny already kind of clarified that it's not a personal data, it's more of a environmental data that doesn't go into the GDPR.
But in any event, in the terms of use, you need to specify to the contributor what type of uses you will make out of his contribution. And it's advisable that you specify if it will be only research or non-profit or maybe also commercial activities.
My question is that the project itself might not know. Let's say we produce the data as a project, but then we pass it on to data repositories. What happens there and who uses the data is completely outside of our control.
I can tell you what EmoteNet does, and this is not only for citizen science data, it's in general for the our idea around the open. So first of all, the data in general is most of the times belonging to the data collector, data holder, if you want to say the project. But then when you go into EmoteNet, you accept the fact that your data A is going to become openly available. You can control the terms and the references of how your data is going to become available. But then this data is integrated also in the harmonized, standardized data products that are of pan-European level. And these data products are open access with a Creative Commons license. Meaning that they are accessible to everyone for whatever use they may put in this data. If this is referred to in the terms of references of the project, I think you are fully covered. And I think that also it's quite important to change a little bit the mentality behind how we treat data, because we have advanced a lot in the last 10 to 15 years, but we haven't advanced enough. It is necessary, especially for projects that are collecting information with public resources. This information, and citizen science mostly fall under this category. This data needs to be available openly for whatever use, and this doesn't have to be demonized. It's added value, and this added value is also for the blue economy. I admit that I'm happy that I'm working in the marine domain and I don't have to worry of considerations of ownership of land that are scary enough. Thank you, Ezgi, but yes.